Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we have two feminists as our guests, though perhaps not of the type you're used to. The first, Christina Hoff Sommers, is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, whose recent book, Feminism, outlines a somewhat surprising history of the feminist movement. In the second half of the hour, we'll be speaking to Linda Chavez, the highest-ranking woman in the Reagan White House, who perhaps first came to your attention when her nomination for Secretary of Labor by George W. Bush, slating her to become the first Latina to hold a cabinet position, was shot down by a search-and-destroy mission mounted by the political opposition. But first, it's out the door on another field trip, this time to Washington, D.C., where I'm meeting Christina Hoff Sommers for a drink at the Irish Whiskey Public House on 19th Street.
Hi there, what can I get you on a drink?
Do you have Riesling?
And Doers on the Rocks. Thanks so much. Christina, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
It was a pleasure to read through Feminism. I got some background I had never heard before, and I thought it might be good to take us back in history a little bit and get some exposure to what you call the founding foremothers of feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft and Hannah More, and the two threads of feminism laid down. Let's start with Mary Wollstonecraft, which you call the first feminist philosopher.
Yes.
Tell us about her.
She was an extraordinary woman and the first woman to find her way into the Western canon. I mean, she was quite brilliant.
About what time was this?
This was the 18th century.
18th century.
And she was a proponent of women's rights and very much influenced by the European Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And she simply thought that freedom and liberty and worth applied to both men and women. That was considered a radical idea at the time. She was also unbelievably adventurous and lived a life that one of the most exciting lives of her century.
Of her time.
She had lovers and she was running around and writing books and being a reporter.
And
all sorts of
accepted in
things.
male society?
No, I mean not accepted. She was an outlier, a very controversial figure, and even others involved in the women's movement were
not sure about it.
No, certainly. So it really took 100 years for her reputation to be resurrected because she was scandalous at the time.
But you call her thread egalitarian feminism. Why?
She emphasized that men and women were essentially the same in their spirit and soul and deserving of the same rights.
Which is a very modern idea.
Very modern. She was very much ahead of her time and arguing against some very backward thinking from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Oh, thank you. And others. But again, her activism was she was a strong believer in women's education, that women should be educated on a par with men. And she just thought that women were sort of artificial. And she was right. They were held back and held down and not really accepted into the world of philosophy and science.
And her writing wasn't really brought out until much later?
Her writing was very controversial. She was considered a kind of eccentric by mainstream society and was made fun of and treated the ways sometimes feminists are treated today. So she was successful really with a small coterie of followers.
Thought leaders.
It would be later that she had a great influence. And then Virginia Woolf would remark that, her thinking has become our reality. But she was way ahead of her time.
And then you contrast her with Hannah More, who you call the founder of maternal feminism. What was the difference?
Yes, this is sort of the lost history of feminism. Importantly, whenever women have made the greatest progress, historians have found, you go back and you find there were two streams. I mean, one was more conservative and was more radical. And both were critically important to women's emancipation. Now, Hannah More, some would call her an arch-conservative. Others think that she was the first conservative feminist. And she sort of met women where they were. She very much believed there was a feminine nature, that women were caring and nurturing, different from men, but equal. Different but equal. And she believed in an empowered femininity. She had a concept of domestic heroines, and that just as women were caretakers in the home...
Florence Nightingale kind of view.
Yes. Florence Nightingale was very much in that tradition. She thought that just as women would care and nurture in the home, so they should be doing it for the nation. And she urged women of all classes, poor women and a small number of middle-class women, aristocratic women, to get out of their homes and engage in good works, philanthropy.
Volunteerism, basically.
Yes, and this would turn out to be very subversive in a good way. Women listened to her. She was hugely influential.
You mentioned her books outsold Jane Austen's.
Yes.
That's hard
Yes.
to imagine.
She wrote books that outsold Tom Paine. I mean, she was
Really?
probably one of the most famous women and admired and friends of the leading men of her age. So was Mary Wollstonecraft, but a different group. And the thing about Hannah More is that she was urging women to become educated, to make something of themselves. But she spoke of it in terms that women could understand, women
Accept.
related to, and women liked.
And didn't set off the immune system in the male community either.
That's right. In fact, there are some historians, there's a wonderful group of historians at UCLA who actually think that she was doing that deliberately, that she was more progressive than she appears to be, but she was able to get around the resistance.
Packaging the message in a better way. How come history has forgotten her?
Well, history forgets a lot of people, but I will say this, she is not celebrated in Women's History Month, and I had found some women's history books that denigrated her and spoke of her as an apologist for the patriarchy. And I think that's so unfair because of how effective she was in creating a revolution, largely in the area of education and women's volunteerism.
So she actually made progress.
She made progress. Now, I'm not saying one was better than the other. I'm not saying, oh, Hannah More, yes, and Mary Wollstonecraft. No, I'm saying we needed both. You need to have a kind of creative, radical edge, but then you need someone who can use that message, but translate it into terms that are...
It's the classic yin and the yang.
It's the yin and the yang,
You need
yes.
both.
By the way, they didn't cooperate. They didn't like each other.
Yeah, I would imagine not. Let's fast forward through the suffragette period and come right to modern times and Betty Friedan's 1963 manifesto, The Feminine Mystique, which many date as the beginning of the modern feminist movement. How did she touch things off in her time?
She's a complicated figure. I reread The Feminist Mystique fairly recently, and there are parts of it which are inspiring. And she had this idea that women should be self-determining beings and in charge of their fate. But on the other hand, there are lots of passages where she denigrates the housewife in terms which are so insulting. When the book came out, the letters poured into various magazines that had printed passages from the book, and women were offended. But one thing about her, she didn't attack men so much. Betty Friedan liked men. She didn't introduce what we have now in contemporary feminism, a very powerful strain of misandry, of dislike of men. You don't find much of that in Betty Friedan. And later she came even to regret the things that she had said, the harsh remarks she'd made about family and
About traditional...
and traditional women, yes.
So she founded the National Organization for Women, which is still with us today. And how has its course charted over the years?
What's interesting is that around in the early 60s, people forget this, but some of the most important legislation was passed because of a coalition of Republicans and Democrats. Now, the National Organization for Women was fairly radical right away. It didn't have to be. It could have been. That was an opportunity where those two groups could have come together. But it didn't happen, and even Betty Friedan was soon drummed out, and Gloria Steinem and others assumed more leadership, more important roles. But the National Organization for Women, very soon after it was formed, there was a lot of antagonism towards ordinary people.
If you didn't get with the program, you were out.
Right.
Yeah, it's very, very, very exclusionary.
And then with the Equal Rights Amendment, which again people have forgotten.
Well, I was there. I remember the battle for the Equal Rights Amendment
But before
and how
the
close
battle,
it came.
Because there was so much agreement. And there were several Republican presidents were in favor of it. You go back to Nixon, and
it was a feel-good opportunity.
Americans just wanted to affirm their respect and regard for women and their belief in equality of opportunity.
Remind our younger listeners what was in the Equal Rights Amendment.
Well, it simply said that there shall be no discrimination, that men and women will be equal before the law.
In all things.
Yes.
And who could object to that?
Who could object to that? Well, along came Phyllis Schlafly. Initially, she was invited, I think, to a bookstore in Connecticut to debate the ERA. And she said, well, I don't really know that much about it, and I'm more interested in strategic defense, and let me debate that. He said, no, read about it. At the time, she thought she might be for it. She read the fine print. And she listened to what the women's groups were saying, and she saw that for them it was not a celebration of opportunity. Phyllis Schlafly realized that the Equal Rights Amendment did not mean equality of opportunity. For many of the women's groups and the activists, it meant that men and women would become the same, that all the laws, including
The draft.
including things like single-sex schools, those would be in violation of the law, as well as anything that made gender salient. So any manifestation of difference would be against the law.
Which is an invitation to massive litigation.
We would all be in court. I mean, forever and ever. Most people didn't see that. She saw it very early on, and she would go from state to state. It was one of the most amazing grassroots political program in American history. And she didn't even have, fax machines or anything.
Right, this was way before that.
Yeah, she just had a newsletter and a message that people listened to. And she said, this is not about opportunity. It's about social engineering and erasing the difference between the sexes and pretending that we're all just interchangeable, that there's no difference whatsoever.
And she succeeded.
She succeeded. And I will tell you that a lot of excellent women's historians go back, and many of them are strongly feminist, and they don't approve of her politics, but they admire her intelligence, her education, and her the way that she organized.
Her effectiveness and passion,
she was
for
so
sure.
effective. And they also say that had they not been so rigid, there was a famous debate on it was Crossfire, and there was someone from the National Organization for Women, and there was Phyllis Schlafly. And initially, William F. Buckley seemed to be, as a lot of Republicans and conservatives, he was sort of in favor of it and a little surprised
that there was resistance.
That she was, and she said, well, Phyllis Schlafly explained it meant women will be drafted. And then he said, well, maybe it'll just be that they have the choice, that they won't be drafted, but they'll have the choice to serve in the military. And then the person from now said, no, if women are going to be equal, there has to be...
So now leaned into it. They basically
leaned into it, even to the extent of saying women should be in combat. And you could see...
Single-sex bathrooms.
All of it was there. Now, even now, these things are controversial. But at the
Although
time...
it's happening.
Some of it's happening. I don't think we're going to get, women drafted into combat against their will very soon. Well, of course, we're not doing that to men.
Right.
But anyway, it became clear that they were going to use the ERA to
redo society, completely redo society.
To re-engineer society according to their radical egalitarian lights.
And the maternal feminism thread was lost in the process.
It wasn't just lost, it was denigrated.
It was trampled.
Most American women wanted their rights, but they didn't want to be men.
Yeah.
And I think that's true now, but it was very true at the time of the ERA. So as Phyllis Schlafly was able to explain what it entailed, and then the women's group started acting out with fierce protests and, throwing...
got ugly.
They got very ugly and throwing blood and, chaining themselves to state houses and so forth.
Which ended up marginalizing the movement for quite a long time.
It marginalized the movement, and it created a lot of antagonism towards feminism, but many of the hardliners in the feminist movement became rather antagonistic toward the society, but they never gave up their views. They just thought it was a failure, that the patriarchy had somehow...
they retreated to the campus mostly. I mean, that's where you'll find the most radical elements of feminism today.
They retreated to the campus and into their little groups where they never stopped, and to this day. Many of them, there are different schools now of feminism, but there are still hardline egalitarians, especially in Washington, who think that any social policy that has different implications for men and women, then it has to be wrong.
Let's take us up to modern time and one of the drums that politicians keep banging, and that is the paycheck fairness issue. The idea and the oft-quoted statistic that women only make 77% of what men earn. Bring us up to date on that.
Yes, well, that figure is simply the average. You take all the men and women working full-time, and what's the average salary of the woman? What's the average salary of the man?
Not normalized for
don't take
length
into
of career,
account how long have they
education,
been working.
What field they're in.
Exactly. You don't consider any other factors, but just the wages. There will be this gap. However, what matters is not just the raw differences in wages. We want to know a little more. Well, she majored in sociology and he majored in economics. You will make more money if you major in economics. You will make more money if you major... girls could close the gap today if they would stop majoring in English, psychology, communications.
Try petroleum engineering. You'll do quite well.
Yes. Petroleum engineering. I hear naval architects get paid quite a lot. So part of it is majors, and part of it is there are lots of women who take a number of years out of the workplace to raise children, or they They work part-time.
Are
They
there
come
careful
back.
studies that normalize for these factors, years of service, education,
Yes.
field?
Yes.
What do the numbers look like when you do a good scientific job of normalizing?
Best study I've ever seen was commissioned by the Department of Labor. They asked
So it's a government study.
CONSAD. Well, it was a government
Contract.
contract. It was a meta-analysis of, I think, dozens and dozens of studies. And what they found is that when you did all the proper controls, there's something like 5 to 9 cents that can't be explained. However, they don't say that's because of discrimination. It may simply be some other
They don't know.
factor that we don't quite understand.
That's a smaller gap than exists in the White House. How do they explain that?
I think there was a 12-cent gap at the White House. It was very interesting to hear the White House press secretary. At first, he deplored the fact that there was a wage gap, and then he said, "And we don't have one. People are paid fairly at the White House because they just, sort of suggested they had different jobs." Well, yes, and that's the same thing in our society.
If something like the Paycheck Fairness Act passed and opened up the opportunity for litigation, what would it look like?
Well, again, it would be like passing of the ERA. It would be an invitation for endless litigation because the Paycheck Fairness Act had a lot of mischief buried in the details. People talked about, it just means that you can't be punished if you ask about salaries and publicize other people's salaries. There was a lot more to it. It would basically punish employers, not simply for discrimination, which is already against the law, but for making decisions or offering salaries that are what they call the legacy of discrimination. So let's say you are a university and you pay your professors in the business school considerably more than you pay professors in the School of Social Work. Well, what's the explanation? The obvious explanation is there's just a different market.
The market's different, right.
And it's much harder to attract professors of economics, and they have many more opportunities and to earn more money, so it's just a different...
And that would invite litigation.
Well, they would say, why is social work
not highly valued?
Not highly valued. Could that not be a legacy of discrimination, that traditional women's work was considered less valuable than what men typically did? You have to imagine employers facing the possibility of a costly lawsuit in front of a jury where there would be feminist litigators, bringing up these, they're all just ready and ready to go. And they'd probably settle out of court. The only safe harbor would be like a national wage-setting agency. So employers would be told what they could pay because people would be too...
Oh, national price setting works so well that I can...
wage setting. Can you imagine
how that would work?
It was right there. And that's why the way it hasn't passed. It's been introduced over and over again. The Boston Globe came out against it. The Washington Post came out against it. Well, because their editorial board.
So
took
even the liberal newspapers.
Even the liberal newspapers know. They see that it's.
So why does it keep coming back? Is it just a political hobby horse?
It's symbolic.
Yeah.
It's sad to say, but not surprising. Politicians can get a lot of mileage out of it, and they count on journalists not checking the facts, hoping that's changing a little bit. But
Christina, let's move on to a very controversial issue that's sweeping across the country, and many have called it the campus rape hysteria crisis. This is in the news quite a bit. I see it in my own campus at MIT, where I'm very involved. I know you've written and spoken about this. Where are we on that?
Well, this rape campus culture crusade has turned very ugly. I mean, I will preface my remarks by saying that sexual assault is a serious problem. There is far too much of it on campus. However,
everywhere. Why just campus?
Well, yes. Well, it depends. Not everywhere, but on campus you have a lot of young people. You have a lot of binge drinking, people living in close quarters. Lots of terrible things happen, and you do have predators on campus who take advantage of that. And these are horrible cases, and I sympathize with these young women who felt they weren't listened to when something truly awful happened to them. Now, here's the thing. Because it's such a horrible crime, we also have to be very careful about accusing someone of the crime. So we need due process. Unfortunately, that appears on many campuses to just not be in the picture. The Department of Education in 2011 set out new directives, sort of reading the Riot Act to schools. They would be in violation of Title IX equity laws if they didn't take a strong stand. And this letter, this extraordinary letter from an Assistant Secretary of Education, told colleges that young men should be tried and found guilty based not on clear and convincing proof, but it had to be a preponderance of evidence.
Yeah, criminal law doesn't work that way. That's a major change in the rule of law to do that.
A major change. And what happens to these young men who are falsely accused, and the stories are beginning to accumulate because the schools are now coming down very hard. They feel they have to
Well, it's a public relations nightmare for them, and they've got to show they're serious.
They have to show they're serious. They feel they'll lose their funds, so they need to have convictions. And so they have a low standard. Now, who are these? We have these rape tribunals. They could be made up of an assistant dean, a librarian, and 3 undergraduates. I mean, it depends on the school. With no experience. And then sometimes they put, because of the Department of Education, fewer and fewer protections for the young man.
No rules of evidence, no right against self-incrimination, no right to question your witnesses. Yeah, it's I've seen these kangaroo courts, actually.
It's a kangaroo court. And young men are caught up in these. There was a horrendous case at the University of North Dakota where a young man, Caleb Warner, was found guilty by a campus tribunal. He kept pleading, I'm innocent, I didn't do this. She's making it up. But as it happened, I think she'd also filed charges with the police, and the police investigated.
Oh, they did?
And found that not only was he innocent, but she had invented the charges. And they filed charges against her for making
The police did?
The police did, and she fled the state. He then went back to the school and said, look what happened. They investigated, and she's been charged.
And she's on the lam. And so did they right the wrong that they had created?
No, they did not want to let him back in. And finally, they got a lot of bad publicity, and a wonderful civil libertarian group, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, they pursued it. They have been heroic throughout this whole ordeal. And he was eventually allowed to come back, but not without going... his mother has now started an organization of mothers of sons falsely accused. And, we have the Duke lacrosse case. You would have thought we'd learned a lesson or two about that, but we didn't.
It's accelerating. It's become almost a Salem witch trial environment in many places.
Or the McCarthy hearings come to mind. Some people will be old enough to remember the daycare scare in the 1980s.
Oh,
where
particularly in Boston. The Fells Acre case was notorious.
Oh, the Fells Acre case. They were a whole family was accused.
And spent years in prison.
Spent years in prison. Well, it first started, I think, the McMartin School, a little 2-year-old. His mother called the police and said that her child had been horrifically abused in underground tunnels.
Satanic rituals and clown costumes.
And
I remember
animal
all that.
sacrifice.
The Wall Street Journal covered it for years.
Oh, well, Dorothy Rabinowitz was heroic in covering it and declaring it a witch hunt. And there were some very good feminist libertarians, not libertarians, but civil libertarian feminists, who came forward early on, like Wendy Kaminer and Carol Tavris, Ellen Willis at the Village Voice, but they're sister feminists who were more conspiracy-minded, and they were irresistibly drawn to this case because it was sort of
news,
the
it's an
patriarchy and hidden violence and so forth. And so Catherine McKinnon, the feminist theorist, as well as Gloria Steinem, they were active in promoting this, and there were feminist therapists who would work with children. And initially, like the Fells Acre case, the children said it didn't happen, and there was recording. But then they would wear them down, and then the children, the whole families, there would be suggestions, and they would actually
now, it doesn't
create
take that
false
much
memories.
work to take us back to the campus. It doesn't take that much work for a jilted girlfriend or a regretful drunken hookup, which I'm sure happens all the time because of the way these kids drink, and the sexual mores have changed quite a bit. All of a sudden, regrets become rape charges.
Well, people have to understand that we think of rape as some kind of horrible violation, but some women's groups and gender activists are enlarging the meaning of the term to include even consensual sex where there's been alcohol, which, covers a lot of
what goes on campus now.
Well, it goes on in marriages. It goes on everywhere. I mean, people drink and have sex. I don't understand this. I had a debate with a professor at the University of Virginia, a law professor, and I said, wait a minute, what if a young man and a young woman are equally inebriated and they have sex?
Are they both rapists?
And she said, well, they could be.
They could be.
So they could rape each other.
And they both get charged.
Well, I guess it would be who got to the rape,
complaint first. It's quite a frightening environment right now on campus.
By the way, it's not simply this environment of hysteria and I think a lot of false accusations. There's also calls for censorship and students just behaving in a way that is quite mad. I mean, you may have heard about young women at Wellesley College that were traumatized by the presence of a statue on campus.
I wrote about that.
Art project.
Yeah, it was an art project. Some old nebbish in his underwear.
Yeah, I think that's maybe where you had some very funny tweets, and I thought, this guy is great, and I started following you and telling everyone else to. Yeah, so there was things, and then all of this brouhaha over Blurred Lines, this song by Alan Thicke. No, not Alan. What's his name? I'm forgetting it. I think it's Thicke, Mr. Thicke. And the song has "I Know You Want It." That's the line. Others have gone and found that many songs have that line.
No, there are rap songs that are a lot worse than that.
Slate, and then many are worse than that. This is ridiculous. And at Boston University, the young women were the rape culture activists organized, and Thicke had been invited to perform, and they had a petition. Well,